right. Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for making the trek out of the beaten path for our panel. We have a tremendous group here today, and I have the privilege of moderating this conversation. So look, you got our alphabet soup of organizations: DARPA, BARDA, ARPA-H, DIU for me. I'm pretty sure most of you don't know exactly what all the agencies do. I'll admit I certainly didn't know what all of them did. And so maybe we start there. Start with a little bit of scene setting. Organization and mission. So we can start all the way to the end, Sandeep, and go from you.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Sandeep Patel. So I work for the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, or BARDA. And within that, run a team called the Division of Research Innovation Ventures, DRIVE. Our goal is to work with industry large and small to develop life-saving medical countermeasures in the context of public health emergencies. So vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, emerging infectious diseases, pandemic influenza, and chem-bio rad nuke threats.
Thanks, Sandeep. And then Geoff, as Jason mentioned, has two perspectives. He brings the private sector side. He also brings the side having been in the Army, having been at DARPA. And so maybe you can speak a little bit about maybe both your perspective on what DARPA stands for and what it does, and then also how you fit in as a private sector executive.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I'm Geoff Ling. I am a physician scientist, and I was at DARPA, which I'll start with, stands for Advanced Research Projects Agency. I was there for 13 years, and I was the founding director of the biotech office, and where Renee and I worked together, which was pretty awesome. DARPA has a long history of innovation. Its mission was very simple, is to create and maintain U.S. technological surprise and superiority. It was very simple. So the whole idea of DARPA was to create new tech that would keep the U.S. military, primarily, on the cutting edge. And no idea was too stupid at DARPA. In fact, we used to like to say at DARPA is we find ways to say yes. And so I really liked the motto of that, but it really sums up exactly what DARPA does. It funds innovation, but for the singular purpose of national security. So I want to be clear on that. I got so fat, short, and ugly that the Army kicked me out. They couldn't stand it anymore, so they threw me out. And so I had to find another job. So I joined the private sector, where I spun out one of my DARPA programs, actually, Pharmacy on Demand. And the concept there is to develop technology wherein providers can make their own medicines at the point of care, starting from any sort of starting material. So in essence, it breaks down the supply chain. I thought of the idea when I was in Afghanistan in my first tour of duty in 2003. And so what has become a military application has actually become a civilian application. So I do have two sides, a public and a private.
Thanks. Amanda, now you have the longest acronym. There's a lot of letters there.
Yes.
Right? I think I actually missed one when I wrote my notes out. So maybe you can share a little bit about JPEOC, and there's a bunch of letters after that,
sure.
too.
So Joint Program Executive Office, as the DoD's acquisition, we're the advanced development arm, and joint being we work for all the different services, so they don't each have this particular advanced development. So CBR&D is chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and defense. That is
That'll be a quiz at the end.
quite a bit there. There are several offices within that, and like I said, they work for all the services. My particular office is medical, so we develop medical countermeasures against those really nasty bugs and scenarios we don't want to be in, but we have to plan for as having troops all over the world and what our adversaries might use against us.
Thanks, Amanda. Renee, ARPA-H, the newest agency, right?
Yeah, we're the newest kid on the block. So ARPA-H, or the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, really taking on the trajectory when the Biological Technologies Office started at DARPA, really seeing that we were ushering in the age of biotechnology, century of biotechnology, and now Geoff didn't actually get kicked out of DARPA. There's a term appointment at DARPA. So when his term was up, he left. When my term was up, I left DARPA as well and said, I'm never going back to government. I just left the best job in government and went to the private sector. And then the vision for ARPA-H really started to become a reality. And President Biden said, you know what? We love what we're doing with DARPA, but we need this for all Americans. We need this for health very broadly. And so last March, the President and the Congress signed ARPA-H into law. I was sworn in last October to really start to build the business side of the house, so think all the fun stuff like contracting and legal. And now we're getting that in shape since I've been there, taken about 4 months to get there, and now we're really kicking off the technical part of what we intend to do. And our mission is to accelerate better health outcomes for everyone. So we're not measured by the papers that we publish, but truly getting new technologies into the hands of Americans and really trying to close the gap on disparity for the health crisis that we have in our country today.
Thank you. And look, I'll tell you what DIU stands for. DIU, where I'm a reservist, Defense Innovation Unit, founded in 2015. Similar in many ways to the entities folks described here, all about getting commercial technologies into the hands of warfighters, adopting them, leveraging non-traditional companies to the extent possible, and streamlining processes, which is a theme that often comes up when working with the US government. So look, this entire panel is all about how the US government can and, in fact, must work with the private sector to support national security and to support other goals beyond national security. And so we've got a mix of folks here from defense, from HHS, other agencies. And so a big part of this is about, well, what are the things that your end users are looking for, right? And so if we're going to talk about engaging the private sector, I think it's a big, important part to understand what the private sector, what you're looking for there, right? And so it'd be great to hear from all of you, what are the 2-3 things that your end users are looking for in the, let's say, near term, 1 to 3 year horizon, and then let's say longer term, maybe 5 to 10 year horizon.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in. So, one of the things that we're concerned about is pandemic preparedness. And what we've done over the last 16 years of BARDA's existence is to bring 69 products through FDA approvals. And traditionally they've been, vaccines, therapies, diagnostics. But, as we look forward in terms of coming out of COVID, how do we actually prepare for not just the things that we know might come, but the things that could come that we don't know about? I think we get into this space where what we think about as medical countermeasures as products is really different than what we had considered in the past. And I think there's a lot of emerging science, not only in life sciences, but in AI and material science and behavioral sciences that are really creating new possibilities for not only preparing for emergencies like pandemics, but to take them off the table completely. And I think we are looking really hard to work with industry across multiple domains to think creatively about how do we leverage things that are sustainable in a commercial way, but that could be used in this sort of key public health way. Because I think traditionally the biodefense health security community has thought about themselves separate from the private sector in terms of incentives. But I think there's a lot of alignment, and I think mRNA vaccines are a great example of where that can happen. So,
Renee, can we get your perspective on that as well?
Yeah, I mean, so 1 to 3 years is not typical for an ARPA, right? So our timeline is more 5, 10 years or beyond. But a few things that I think you can expect from us in the coming years. So we've adopted at ARPA-H the Heilmeyer questions. So these are the famous framework of about 8 questions George Heilmeyer, an early director of DARPA, outlined that you have to be able to describe the program that you're working on. So all of our projects are not directed by me or mandated by me. They come from program managers that we hire for their big idea that they want to solve. And they have to articulate that across these 8 questions. What are you trying to do? How's it done today? What's new in your approach? What are the risks? How long is it going to take? How much is it going to cost? And then how are you going to track your progress? We've added 2 additional questions, and this is where I think the public should immediately be able to see some of our impact. One is around customer experience and customer input into the final product. We don't want to create anything that people don't want to use on the back end. We would be remiss if we didn't take that customer input, whether it's a healthcare provider or a patient or a caregiver, and say create a tool that they actually want to use. So that's going to be a really important thing that we do up front. We also want to demonstrate that we are addressing costs and accessibility in everything that we do. And so there's a great power in being a funder. We're only a funding agency. There's no intramural labs. And we can write into our contracts, if you're going to do a clinical trial, make sure it's representative of the patients that stand to be impacted by your disease, right? So there's so many clinical trials, as you all know, are very, very biased by the patients that they get access to. And so we will demand up front, we won't give you funding unless you have a way to demonstrate that you're going to be working with the communities that can really, advance the most here.
Super helpful. Geoff, I'm coming back to you, don't worry. Amanda.
So for our space, we're really trying to get out of the one bug, one drug sort of paradigm and trying to look more broad. So broad spectrum, maybe a pre-emergent sort of therapeutic. How do we detect things that are coming that maybe the symptoms aren't there yet? That's sort of the long-range place to where we're looking at. And again, just trying to make these commercially viable. So however we best can do that, and partnering with public health, because that's, as we've seen, it's been a big tie in these bio spaces.
Geoff, so it would be great if you could speak to both your DARPA perspective, but then also if we could transition a little bit to your perspective as an awardee. Right? Talk a little bit about your experience there.
So yeah, at DARPA, it was very clear I was on the government side. So on the government side, you want to do things in the public good. Those are the things that really matter for national security, public health, you name it. Your motivation is purely for the public good. And now I switch over to the private side, and you find that actually clashes a bit. On the private side, it starts with how much money am I going to make? And that is the cold, hard truth. And there are groups that try to balance the good and the money, but the money trumps all. So when you go into the private sector from a public sector, you find that money is the driver. Now, it is absolutely sure that you have to have a sustainable business. We all understand that. So from a CEO standpoint, you're good with that. If I can sustain my business, I can balance it against my desire to do public good and my desire to do national security, because I believe in a double bottom line to what I'm trying to do, all right? That's great. Your investors don't think that at all. Your investors want to make cash. They're going to squeeze you to make cash. That's the way it is. And it's okay. It's okay because that's life. It is when it runs afoul of national security that I have problems with. Because there are groups of investors who the sole drive to make money would trump their desire to understand the greater good, right? And they'll justify it by saying, if I make a lot of money, I'll employ a lot of people. That's the greater good. If I make a lot of money, I absolutely promise you, I will donate to the Starving Children's Fund, right? So, but the reality is that you're going to run into that in the commercial sector. And so how, in fact, do you balance that, and how do you fend it? That is actually not easy, and it's one of the things that I spend a lot of time worrying about, because I do have run across people who are willing to sacrifice national security, the things that my three friends here are working desperately on, to turn a buck. They wouldn't think twice about selling it to an adversary nation if they could make a buck and a half. Because they would make a buck if they left it in the U.S., but they would make a buck and a half if they made it things. And that is the truth. So anybody who doesn't know that, and going into the private sector, you got to think about it. Now, you will find pockets of people who do believe in the double bottom line. I mean, thank God there are people like that, but there aren't that many.
So look, I'm a reservist, as I mentioned earlier, but also have been in big pharma, small biotech. And just drawing upon a past experience, we've been in positions where, from my own, where we were potentially an awardee of a large government grant. And the board said, we really want to take that money. Speaking about the US government money, it's kind of a pain in the rear. There's all these strings attached to it. Honestly, we'll just eat the cost. It's worth it. It's not even, it was a double-digit million still, but as a large pharma company with, you're talking billions of dollars of market cap, totally reasonable to say I can eat the cost, right? And so that perspective is often shared by many, right? And unless you're a specialized house that knows exactly how to work with the government, even writing the grant sometimes is tough because there's jargon, right? And so it'd be great to get the perspective of the folks here who are part of the grant-making organizations to talk a little bit about how you get around this friction, right? This friction that exists for companies that are not traditionally, I won't use terms that are maybe not quite right, but traditionally the people that always apply for government grants, right? To get fresh blood into the system. Sandeep looks like he's ready to jump, and
Yeah,
so we'll start with him.
I could jump in. This is a question that
seat right there. You might even fall off.
Good sensing. This is a question I think about a lot because, we've supported hundreds. If we're just sticking with, let's say, high growth startups in life sciences and health, we've supported hundreds of them. And what's interesting is that every single one of them is in a different place in their journey. They need something different. And I think in general, I think there's a tendency in government to kind of offer one thing and then, kind of have everyone conform to it. And we've taken sort of an opposite approach and said, all right, we want to sort of know where a company is in their life cycle and find what they need and tune our support to them. And so to that end, we sort of created an ecosystem of different ways to support companies. So we don't have annual funding cycles. We do on-demand funding and have a really fast turnaround in terms of how we support them. We do small dollar kind of awards, but then can jump to bigger ones. We do venture capital equity financing because some companies just know how to raise funding that way and no other way, and they just that's what they like. And so we want to be able to support those companies if we need to, so we have that as a tool. We work with companies like J&J and use their incubator space, J-Labs, to support, which some companies know. So again, I think the ecosystem approach is helpful because we've noticed that a lot of companies we work with, they've told us that they would have otherwise not, they just didn't know how to navigate government, they didn't know how to get funding, they didn't know who to talk to, and so it's a good entry point for them.
That's a common theme I hear as well when trying to find performers. So as you mentioned, there are those that continually apply for what's out there in the government. And that's great. We don't want to discourage that. They've figured out the process. But we want to open that aperture, and there are many other companies and technologies that would work with both of us, with both the DoD sector or the government sector and the civilian sector. So I don't know how best to crack that nut. I've tried to diversify how I put out different solicitations and just the different industry meetings that we go to try to help break down some of those barriers.
I mean, obviously being at South by Southwest is part of it.
Yes, absolutely.
Renee, you're new on the block, as you mentioned, right? And so you've got a kind of an interesting way to set the tone in a new way.
We have a few opportunities there. So because we're brand new, we don't have to adopt any of the infrastructure that's there. We can build new. And really unique to ARPA-H, something that doesn't exist at any of the other ARPAs, we have a transition office that's really focused to working with the private sector. One of our first solicitations as an agency was through this transition office to set up partnership intermediary agreements. And so this is a way that if you're a small company or a VC firm and you've literally no idea how to work with government, you can work with a third party who does. And it's like how big universities have a grants office to take care of all this. We want to create a third party to help you through that and make it really simple. On the flip side, this is actually really important for our program managers as well. We may be bringing in people from government or academia who also don't know how to work with the private investment world, which is going to be critical for us to transition. So we can educate some of our program managers through these PIA intermediaries and the ecosystem they work with. If they want to launch a program, let's say in autonomous surgery, they don't know anything about the marketplace, we can reach out to those venture teams that do this for a living, due diligence for a living, and say, hey, program manager, make sure you have these performers at the table as potential proposers. Understand that this is what's already really well funded in your ecosystem. Don't add funds there. We've got it covered. But here's a big gap that nobody's addressing, and you need to de-risk this for others to follow on. And so this is a really important way, even before we launch a program, that we want to engage the private sector. And then you can imagine they become stakeholders throughout the development of the program. And if we're successful in developing these technologies and capabilities, we've de-risked it for them. And then they can be the follow-on, they can be the pull in the marketplace. And so that's really, we're really trying to address this end to end. I want to just flag one other point. I think you're supposed to say Congress in their infinite wisdom. They've now, with the authorities that they've given us at the end of last year, when ARPA-H was really locked into law, they gave us a superpower, and that is that I can reimburse FDA for services rendered. NIH doesn't have this ability, and so we can really bring FDA to the table, and now we're working together with FDA to figure out how can we incentivize industry. What if we can get a pharma company a year sooner to bring a product to market by working with ARPA-H? And that actually is really attractive for a company who is interested in the bottom line, adding new incentives to the whole toolkit.
That's a huge superpower to have.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, Renee, program officers, and how you brought them in and how they think about big problems that they need to solve, right? In the private sector, you have a pull signal. You make a drug, if it doesn't have a market for it, you know clearly that you're going in the wrong direction, right? Now, obviously, there's disincentive, et cetera, but nonetheless, you have a signal that you get, right? Mm-hmm. Could you speak a little bit to how you or the program officers set that technical agenda? And maybe we could actually expand it, not just for ARPA-H, but also for DARPA, folks here I know have experience there, Geoff, you in particular, and then also JPEO.
Yeah, so for ARPA-H, we're a big believer. This is one of the reasons I came into ARPA-H. I want to make sure that we maintain this part of the DARPA business model. We don't want to adopt everything, but the really important piece was the program manager. And so a lot of government agencies and private industry as well set a technical agenda from the top down. That is not the case at ARPA-H or at DARPA. It's a bottoms-up approach. So when we're looking for candidates who want to take on a term appointment to come to ARPA-H, we're looking not only because they can think and act like a CEO, they're decision makers, they're ambitious, they're not afraid to take risks, but they bring a really big idea in health that they want to solve. Not a single one of our dollars is linked to a disease or a platform, totally wide open scope as long as it's in health. And so this year, I hope to hire 20 program managers, each 20 different projects. And so we're really looking for, okay, what is the investment? What's the problem that they want to solve? And if we invest in that, we're not making an incremental change, but we can see this changing the direction of a field. And so that is hard to look for in a candidate. The application process is pretty intense. We go through not only the CV, but the Heilmeier questions that I described to you. And then we have a conversation. And if there's chemistry there, if we agree that it's going to be a good fit, then we bring these folks in for a job talk, and then hopefully they come on board. Then within the first 3 months or so, they launch programs. And it's rinse and repeat. So we have a flywheel. Program managers should launch a new program once per year or so. And this way you can kind of imagine we're catalyzing the entire ecosystem across a variety of topics.
Are you taking resumes? I don't know if folks
Absolutely.
here looking at jobs.
Yes.
I'm sure you're all on USA Jobs all the time.
Not USA Jobs.
Oh, wow.
In
okay.
fact, I have direct hiring authority. So we recently liked a candidate on a Friday, hired them on a Monday. So we can move very quickly. And I can, it's my favorite trivia question, I could hire up to the president's salary. Anybody know what the president's salary is?
400?
Very good. So we're industry competitive-ish. We don't offer equity, but your equity is that you get to contribute to advancing goals for the American public.
Oh, now that's a second superpower. All right. Amanda, JPEO.
Always looking for program managers that are looking outside, again, being innovative. Kind of like our contracting, it is USA Jobs. It is a little harder to get into our space. But through our different contracts, contract staff is usually where we find a lot of help, and kind of shared through the different industries. I think several of my staff have gone through NIH and then over to us, so I think there's a lot of synergy in that space as well with personnel and moving projects.
Geoff, do you want to speak to how that works within DARPA, setting the technical agenda,
DARPA,
especially at the BTO, which you founded, of course?
Yeah, no, DARPA works, you get tapped. So what we do is at DARPA, we explored the performer base. That's a good place where we would find future talent. Of course, within the active services, about 10% of the DARPA program managers are active duty, such as I was. But the vast majority come from industry and academia, and that's what it is. We're constantly looking for talent and you get tapped. You said, geez, you look like you have DARPA material, like Renee, and we say, come on, tell us your great story, and we go from there. But the key thing to remember is DARPA is a term-limited job, so it takes a very special person who's willing to step out of their very successful career track to do a stint at DARPA and then go back again. So you do have to work with their primary employer so that they would have a job to go back to when they get done. But nobody stays at DARPA for a career, nobody. Even the director goes all the way down to generally a stint at DARPA is about 4 years long. And that's, so it's a big deal. It's like a sabbatical, but it's a remarkable sabbatical. I think Renee and I both would agree that it's definitely worth doing, but there is that element to it that it's a term-limited job. The whole idea at DARPA was you're not going to become a bureaucrat. You're not going to be there long enough for your seat to take the shape of your butt.
I think this is a really important point, right?
Yeah.
Because a big criticism is always ending up with a perpetual pet project. And having had that insight that you had to really shape it so you didn't have the seat shaped to your butt, as you put it, is really important, I think, right? Sandeep, thoughts of BARDA. Do you have a superpower as well?
We have a few superpowers. Well, I'll tell you sort of, at least within Drive, we're a 60-person team, and what I really appreciate in the philosophy we sort of bring in is I think there's a lot of magic in the tension of different perspectives in different fields on how they view a problem. And I see this all the time. We have people who are, life scientists, engineers, behavioral scientists. We have, former VPs of pharma companies and people who've been on manufacturing lines, clinical ops experts, and it's sort of interesting how everyone views problems in a completely different way. And so we embrace that in terms of how we view something. And I think one of the things that we bring to our partners is we get a lot of starry-eyed startups who think that they do have a great idea, but they see this straight line to scale, right? And I don't think that they often don't realize the pitfalls, And so when you even talk about things like how you're going to manufacture this product at scale, that becomes a black box, right? And so this is something that we bring to the table because we know people have seen things fail in multiple ways, and so I think that's the kind of perspective, that sort of real live perspective and the vision to see how this is going to actually get to people at the end of the day.
That's helpful. Geoff, I'll start with you on this next question. From your perspective at OnDemand Pharma, incentives, push versus pull mechanisms. What works for you?
So at OnDemand, the question is push-pull and what works for us. I would say that a couple of things that what helps us where we are at OnDemand is we have a close relationship with the government. I embrace it. The government has been my best friend. But we understand the constraints that funding comes with. So that funding is R&D funding. We can only use it for R&D. And what does that mean? That you can't use it for commercial development, you can't use it for patent prosecution, oddly enough, but you cannot, that's illegal, and a number of other things. But if you understand those rules, you can work with the government on that. So that is key. So understanding what Renee and Sandeep and Amanda are trying to do with their performers is key. But I will say a real push and is the fact that there is this remarkable relationship with the government. In fact, I have an 8-to-1 ratio, government to private dollars, to give you an example. So my company is now worth about $500 million, and I have over 100 employees, but we built it on $13 million of private equity dollars because of my relationship with the government. That's number one. Number two, Renee spoke about the FDA. That's key. A highly regulated industry. If I'm building airplanes, the same thing. That's the other thing that you get. But I want to point out there's one real big thing that we're not talking about. When you work with any of my 3 friends here, it's transparency. When you work for the government, there's a lot of oversight. All my 3 friends here are going to pay close attention to how they spend their money because it's taxpayer dollars, and to see that we are performing. And why is that important? Because this is not a Theranos game here. I mean, the big difference with Theranos, they did it in a closet, right? Whereas when you work with the government, it's very transparent. It is that level of risk reduction that is key when you go into the investment community to say, look, BARDA was oversighting this. ARPA-H, JPEO, the government's eyes were on this technology. And if you believe that the government, and we all should, know what they're doing from a technical standpoint, then that is the biggest endorsement you'll ever get. So I think those are the things. Then the last thing I would say is that, again, I actually embrace this public good thing. You know, you asked an earlier question I don't think I'd answered. What are the top 2 or 3 things you worry about? Number one, I will tell you, I'm a practicing physician. I still see patients. I'm a Johns Hopkins intensivist. I run the unit. Number one, nursing shortage. If we don't fix that, our whole system is going to collapse. At Hopkins, we are already down by 1/3 of our nurses. That means no elective surgery. That means shutting down the clinics. You know, we talk about all the new stuff. This new stuff is worthless unless you can get it to the patient. Amanda can talk to this more eloquently because she is a nurse. Second is the disparity of health. That is just criminal in my mind. You look at some of the drugs that get, and the wonderful diagnostics that my friends are investing with taxpayer dollars. These guys run out. Now they charge an exorbitant fee, and guess who gets cut out of it? The new, some of the new drugs are coming out, $50,000 a year. Doesn't sound like a lot to you, but to a lot of people, it means the difference between food or putting a kid through college. That's a big freaking deal. So I would say those 2 big things need to be solved. We can spend all the freaking money we want on a new cancer drug. We can spend all the money we want on a new Alzheimer's drug. But you don't stop that disparity of health, that means some people are going to get it and some people are not. That is fundamentally wrong.
Couldn't agree more. So we've talked about grants. We've talked about superpower like FDA engagement. Sandeep, Amanda, in terms of another pull, purchase commitments or purchase orders that you can do in advance. Other pulls that you guys have been thinking about beyond the traditional grants, beyond the FDA, other areas that you think are maybe more exploratory that we may want to explore in trying to incentivize where there is, to Geoff's point, an inherent market failure.
So we do other OTAs for a lot of things, so it's prototyping. We're trying these technologies out. And I have access personally to several OTAs, one being DIU, and we were able to reach quite a few different performers using this mechanism. And again, it brings that government oversight, brings our relationship with the FDA to get these products through. And then as the progression of the technology, we see where it goes, and potentially there's a procurement contract at the end of this. So, you know, these are some of the incentives that we have for industry
A couple thoughts here. So first of all, 2 separate. So one is that BARDA has one pull mechanism that it uses, and it was used during Operation Warp Speed to some extent during the pandemic, which is there's a purchasing that happens with some products, and they get put in what's called the Strategic National Stockpile for emergency use, and that's a powerful market incentive for a lot of products. But separately, I think there's an interesting sort of philosophical point here, and maybe it hits on a little bit what Geoff was saying, a little bit what Renee was saying. So I think the industry, you know, I would characterize the life sciences industry as being very conformed to specific types of things, right? We know small molecule drugs, we know, therapeutic antibodies, we have these classes. And everything kind of fits there, and everybody wants to fit there. And there's like a pathway, like the FDA, the regulatory system is sort of tuned to that. The manufacturing system is tuned to that. The marketing, the way things are marketed is tuned to that. And I think that's an unintended consequence of stifling some experimentation on that front. And I think part of this issue too is that we don't sometimes do a good enough job of laying out what the whole market is and how to entice companies to develop things for a broad set of populations. And I think there's a real opportunity for us and others to like define these pathways for new classes of things. Like we tend to fund experimental things at early stages. What we don't do is offer a roadmap of like, if you do this, then it'll unlock this, and then you can do that, and then this is how we're gonna benefit health, improve health for all populations. And like laying that out really clearly is a huge de-risking opportunity for the market. And I think it's a pull incentive that frankly we don't do enough of.
So let's go a little bit more macro. And I think we've been touching a little bit on this a bit, but in the private sector, it's kind of easy to know what winning looks like. right? To Jeff's point around money, I mean, that's a pretty clear signal. Share price, market dominance, approvals, et cetera, right? Like it's pretty clear if you're doing right or you're doing wrong. And yeah, sure, there's a little bit of a lag from R&D to commercialization. That exists, no question about that. But what does winning look like within the agencies that you represent, right? Within ARPA-H, within JPO, within BARDA, right? What does that look like for you guys, right? I know you don't have to do your annual goals the same way that Geoff and I do, right? But nonetheless, I'm sure you're thinking about it.
So for me, it's an easy question, or easy answer. It's the warfighter. I'm here to develop medical countermeasures to protect our warfighters wherever they are in the world.
But if I could push back on that for 1 second,
Sure.
if you don't mind. So I agree with you, yes.
Yeah.
Right? But how do you check to say I did this or I didn't do it, right? Is it I need to transition X things over Y years? Is it something else, right? That's what I'm trying to get at.
As my end, I'm the advanced developer, so my win is what I am providing to the warfighter. Now, what I'm working with my either S&T partners with or my other government agency partners and moving that technology for the win. So, I really have the end of the line, I feel like.
No, that's helpful. Renee, you were about to jump in there.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's still early days, right? But there's a few things that I think
Getting space.
we must we must have early on, and this is demonstrating that there's $1.7 trillion in HHS. That's bigger than the Department of Defense budget. But yet we have this little $2.5 billion that's set aside for ARPA-H to be different, to take big risks. And so I think success for us early on is demonstrating the programs that we are funding, that they are taking a risk that nobody else in the commercial sector or the rest of HHS is able to take. We measure health outcomes, and so making sure that we're building that into our programs, that it's not just something we measure 15 years from now, but what does the health outcome look like in the next year, 2 years, 3 years? I think we also need to be using our authorities that Congress has given us. So we can do OTs as well, but we also have prize authority. And so, what are the different ways that we can really implement and use these tools? Prize challenges, of course, will be much shorter timelines to demonstrate the art of what's possible. And then I think last but not least is, I tell this every member of Congress that I talk to, we're very lucky to have bipartisan support. Everybody wants us to be successful. They have a different way of how they think about this. But I remind them that for us, success is going to look a little bit like failure. If we're not shooting for the moon, we should be an agency that creates the next moonshots. We will fail sometimes, and that has to be okay. We have to be very transparent, to your point. We want everybody to know why we failed so nobody else makes that mistake. But we have to be allowed to make those mistakes. And that's the culture that I hope I can be there and create and allow for that innovation.
Deep.
I have so for BARDA, I mean, I think we're sort of dealing with this sort of prevention paradox where I think if we're successful, nothing bad happens, and I think the DoD has a similar sort of,
Yeah.
which is always a problem because when you're successful, nobody knows you're successful, and how do you, it's just this constant battle. And so, yeah, in terms of emergencies, I think that our goal is to be prepared for any eventuality, right, and quickly, but I have one sort of question, maybe I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction because I think it's an interesting one. One question I keep thinking about in terms of health overall is that, the question we don't often ask ourselves is, assuming that Renee doesn't solve the mortality issue and makes humans live forever, the question of how should we die ideally, right? Because we always talk about eliminating disease, and then you knock the number one thing off, but then the next thing pops up as number one, and so then the real question is how do we want people to die? And I think that's the important question in terms of health. And
now we're getting a really philosophical conversation here, right? We're going in a whole other direction.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's something that always, it's my party question that I ask
and
people,
if you ask an economist, they would tell you all kinds of things, right? I learned this working with the Congressional Budget Office at one point. Yes. Maybe we'll come back to that question. Unless anyone here wants to speak to how do we want to die. We'll come back to that. Maybe that's the happy hour. Okay, so look, another macro question. And Geoff, to your point earlier, you said you got 100 employees, right, at OnDemand Pharma. You said that you have 100 employees right now at OnDemand. What do you think about in building a team on your side, and then from the side of the granting organizations, what do you look for in a grantee that goes beyond just the technology, goes beyond the product, right? And I ask this question because being in biotech, one of the biggest things is actually not a shortage of capital in the Cambridge ecosystem. It's actually a shortage of leadership teams, executives to run biotech companies. That's a limiting factor, actually, right? And so I'm very curious to get your thoughts on this.
It comes back to it, the question you just asked, is what's a win? And does the leadership team embrace that win? The win can be a monetary win, but I think that's very simplistic. The win in the world of health, and what we're talking about really now in health, is actually, are you making a meaningful impact in somebody's life, ultimately? Is it a child with a rare disease? Is it a community? Where is it? So I'll give you an example, a more tangible example, if I may. So for my company, OnDemand, is what I told you about, we're developing deployable manufacturing capability to address shortages. So right now, we already have our first 3 beta sites that we're going to deploy to in 2024. We already know who they are. One is a very large healthcare system in an urban environment, huge. Another one is in the southeast of America, a very smaller healthcare system, but they're servicing some of the poorest areas in the country. In fact, they're federally designated rural at-need community. And the third one is a government site. The same technology is going to go to all 3 sites. To me, that's a win. Why? Because we're able to address the needs of a large, urban, fairly wealthy community. Demographics are what they are. We can go to the southeast of the United States, a rural, underserved area where it's over 90% Medicaid. To me, that's a win because we're able to service them, and they're a very different demographic. And then the third one, of course, is government, which is where my heart lies. But the point is to me is finding a leadership group that embraces that as the mission. That it's not, yes, we have to develop a sustainable business. We get it. And we have to develop the wonderful technology. We get it. But at the end is what's the win? And do we all embrace that win? And if the win is breaking down the barriers that we just talked about, again, I'm very despondent over this disparity issue. It worries me night and day. And so if we're able to, in our first beta site, show you that we can actually meet poor, rich, minority, Caucasian, so on and so on, Northeast, Southeast, you get it. If we can do that, and my people around me embrace that as a true win, and they're willing to work night and day for it, that's what we've got.
Others, teams, what do you look for?
So for our partners, kind of what Renee was saying, not everything is going to work out. Although I am on the further end of development, I'm looking for the partner that's willing to work through the fail and to continue that development.
Yeah, I'll riff a little bit off what Geoff said. I was, while he was speaking, just reflecting back to the best performer relationships that I had as a program manager at DARPA, and it wasn't the most brilliant person often. It was a person that was willing to sit down with me as a program manager, roll up their sleeves, and we were solving that problem together. They were willing to collaborate. I was trying to be a good listener. They were trying to be a good listener for the assets that we brought to the table from government. We could bring the regulators, the payers to the table, maybe another performer that solved one of their technical problems, but that openness. And I know a little bit about what Geoff's doing now, and in each of those locations, you have a partner that's kind of your counterpoint, right? And so it's like finding those people that are going to be at the table with you to solve together is what I look for in a really great performer.
Sandeep, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, similar, I think we tend to focus oftentimes as funders on the science and the technology, and probably not enough on the individual and the team. It's really that's what matters, because they're going to fail. But their ability to persist through that problem is really important. And this is what I actually appreciate about the venture capital community. I think they're particularly good at things like that, around being very intentional about building good teams and companies they support. And I think that's the most critical aspect of it. Yeah.
That's helpful. Renee, you used the word moonshot earlier. Let's come back to that for a second. Established, obviously, ARPA-H new organization. There's some criticism out there that suggests that ARPA-H is an offshoot of the President's Moonshot Initiative, or it's NIH 2.0. Can you provide more color?
Yeah, that's a lot of the myth busting that I've had to do since I've come on board a few months ago. So we were sort of uttered in the same breath as the reinvigoration Moonshot 2.0 for cancer and ARPA-H. And so we really need to be an agency that launches the next moonshots. But as mentioned earlier, we're disease agnostic. Not a single dollar is linked to a specific disease. That said, we are completely open to pursuing the objectives of the cancer moonshot. And I think some of the most really interesting advances that people are hoping for us to do will be on cancer-related innovation. So absolutely in scope. But we, again, funding agency, very small footprint. In fact, Congress has capped us at 210 employees across 3 sites. So like really light footprint. We're not going to have labs. It's the teams that we fund that are going to do the work.
Amanda, you mentioned earlier Project Panacea.
Yes.
It's a partnership with DIU to put in play. Can you talk a little bit about how JPO works with entities like DIU, how that went, and why it was so important for this particular project?
So Project Panacea came from DARPA. It transitioned, I had a solicitation out, and JPO got some performers, was working through that contracting space, and then got a little more resources. My initial contracting shop was kind of busy, so I started looking in the periphery what I could do quickly and expand my portfolio to something that wasn't the traditional vaccine. So this is my vaccine portfolio. And what we've coined it is our biological response modifier. So we're, again, not going after the one bug, one drug, but how do we impact something before it actually infects the body? When I worked with DIU, we got 35, I think, proposals or something to that effect, much more than I got even on my solicitation months prior. And many of the performers were outside that government space. So for me, it was another outlet to the world as a whole and what they could offer the DoD. We were very happy with that and have worked several contracts now in that Project Panacea. So we'll continue to advance that space, kind of to Sanjeev, that gray area of how do we get these through now through the FDA. So we'll continue that.
And I think there's an important takeaway here. And I had even forgotten about the DARPA linkage, right? With the progression of programs that go from DARPA to another entity like JPO, to partnering with DIU, to working with the FDA, so on and so forth, right? And I think that has to be really taken into account here, right? The opportunity that the folks here around on the stage can really, to really push or pull programs across the alphabet soup of agencies that have different funding authorities, that have different value adds for a private sector awardee. I'm getting a signal here, or I was getting a signal here. I think at this point we're going to open up questions to the audience, right? Yes.
Hi, thank you. James from Decisive Point. We're an early stage venture capital firm focusing on health meets dual use, deep tech, and government.
Can you hold it up just a little bit?
Sure.
Perfect.
Yeah, I was just curious. A lot of the innovations we've talked about today, they're brilliant, very interesting, but really the technologies and tools that are underpinning a lot of them come from the biomanufacturing sector. Who in the federal government is responsible for innovation in biomanufacturing, supply chains, and that kind of part of the ecosystem?
You asked like $1 million question.
So we have a whole effort within BARDA and the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response to essentially make the supply chain across biomanufacturing more resilient, right? Investing in various approaches, thinking about and investing in more on-demand continuous manufacturing, simpler supply chains, onshoring, reshoring technologies and things like that. So there's a huge effort underway on that front. And we're really open through a variety of different programs looking for novel technologies that can allow for, either in a rapid response scenario to make things really quickly. A lot of it which was pulled from DARPA in the past, but also really thinking about, and not just in drugs and biologics, but in devices and things like that as well. So, yeah.
You're spot on. There needs to be a lot more effort. A lot more effort. So this issue of biomanufacturing, this is the issue of manufacturing in general, actually, has been woefully ignored, quite frankly. And it wasn't until COVID demonstrated our incredible vulnerability to a very, very fragile supply chain. And so you're spot on. The government needs to do a lot more, in my opinion. And in my opinion, now I'm not involved in biomanufacturing at all, but your point is very excellent, that in fact there should be an office, if not in the HHS and potentially in commerce, because this is a problem that's coming, and it's going to get a whole lot worse. But COVID would really expose this incredible vulnerability that we have by not having biomanufacturing really as a marquee element of our community.
Thanks for the question. Other questions from the audience? And over here.
Hi. Yeah, actually, hi. Derek Tweed with Lumio. I guess I'm curious about your opinion about diversity inclusion in clinical trials. Saw a stat recently that really 4% of clinical trials actually meet a diversity and inclusion. And then the data capture around that, or else real-world data capture in parallel to the clinical trial, so that the companies have a better idea of how the drug is working in people. Wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. So at least from the ARPA-H perspective, part of the design of our programs from the bottoms up, I won't give a bank account to a program manager unless they have a plan to address exactly what you're saying. Whatever the disease you're working on or the indication you're trying to pursue, making sure that the clinical trials are representative of the communities that are impacted the most. It's easy to say, it's a lot harder to do, because a lot of the clinics in areas maybe of where there are underrepresented communities might not be equipped to be able to do things like real-time data capture, right, or real-world capture. So these are the types of investments that I think we have an opportunity to work alongside with other companies that could help us enable that capability, right, bridge that gap. So I think you're hitting on exactly what we're trying to unlock as we move forward with ARPA-H.
Cool. One thing to add real quick to that is I mean, clearly there's a huge problem, and I think clinical trials overall and how we do it is just a massive problem, and the diversity is one of the biggest dimensions of that. I'm still surprised, and I think we tend to think of this as a technology problem. There's a lot of people working on the technology piece of it, but at the end of the day, participating in a clinical trial, you're risking your own body to advance, science, and I think there's a huge trust piece in there, right? And so, we've been looking at approaches to sort of build trust within communities and stuff like that, but I think it's a massive problem, yeah.
Sandeep, I think you make a terrific point there too. You look at some of the centers where, and I'll give you my perspective just from the private sector, some of the centers where you do a lot of your studies, it turns out those centers don't seem to have a lot of real representation of the communities around them, right? And so there's a little bit of a trust issue there that communities did not feel those centers really treated them, right? And so if they don't come to those centers, then they can't get access to studies. So there's it's a multifaceted problem. I think we had a question over there.
Hey folks, Conrad Holloman, Director of Government Programs at The Engine. We're a venture capital fund spun out of MIT, primarily focused on tough technologies. And I really wanted to ask every member of the panel, looking over the next year, looking forward, what excites you most about where things are heading? What are you most excited about looking forward in terms of the programs you're building, or where you see the technology going?
Great question. Who wants to go? Sandeep's ready to jump in.
Jeff's excited about it.
Geoff, let's have you go.
Go ahead.
Just a couple things. I mean, we invest in a lot of different areas around like, disease prevention and rapid response. I think one thing that's about to become much more real really soon is our ability to predict sepsis and to treat sepsis. This is a pervasive problem. Even things like when you talk about COVID infections and flu infections, some people have very severe adverse reaction versions of that, and some people have mild versions of that. And the ability to predict that and to treat quickly is extremely important. And those capabilities are coming online at scale now. So I think that's huge.
You know, it's hard to say what is the most exciting thing. It's a really good question, because that's why you get a lot of pause from your panel here, because that's a great question. I think that what excites me most, honestly, is the fact that Renee is starting up ARPA-H. It's a new infusion of excitement, a new infusion of money into this enterprise. The sepsis would be awesome. I took care of a septic patient just about 2 months ago, and that is really hard to take care of.
Yeah.
Really hard to take care of. I took care of COVID patients, really hard to take care of. But these things are what are galvanizing the community to really start to focus. There's a lot of problems to be solved. Let's be blunt. I mean, there's a lot. We don't talk about mental health. We're talking about childhood autism. We're talking about a number of things, pancreatic cancer. Those things have been percolating around for thousands of years, right? I mean, glioblastoma multiforme, the thing that killed the president's son, we're nowhere close. So these are all things that we are nowhere close. But there's hope on the horizon. I mean, there's so many new approaches, you know, the immunotherapies, for example. There's now new approaches in terms of mental health. The whole idea of telehealth, that's a big deal. We're now able to bring care into people's homes. This is not a little thing. Telehealth basically means that people can now have access to care that they didn't before. You know, the shut-ins and all this stuff. So as a practicing physician, I'm actually very excited about those seemingly mundane things. But to me, it means how are we getting health care to people who don't have health care right now, or adequate health care. That to me is exciting. I'm less excited about, to be perfectly honest with you, about some of the new breakthrough technologies and stuff, as much as I see about getting health care to people who don't have it right now, to these underserved communities. That's a big deal. And just the whole idea of bringing mental health seriously to the Indian Health Services, bringing it to some of the more distressed areas in our inner cities. That's how you're going to make a big impact in health, in my opinion.
Amanda, Renee, what do you guys think?
So for me, it's the policymakers with some more light on the chem-bio sphere of influence and how it really does impact the world as a whole. My particular population is pretty small, but you know, the recent pandemic showed that they really do need to put resources towards this and policy to help develop medical countermeasures in that space.
For me, every time I hear a job talk at ARPA-H, I'm just thrilled, right?
Yeah.
To totally different domains. But the thread that's really giving me a lot of energy and momentum is around AI. And so the capability that AI is going to give us to start to dig through the data deluge. And it's surprising to me, having been in Department of Defense, where literally classified Army, Navy, Air Force systems talk to each other seamlessly. You don't miss a millimeter or a millisecond for targeting, but I can't send my kids' like pediatrician's electronic health record to like the local hospital. This literally just happened to me. I'm like, we know how to do this, but we're not doing it. And so I'm really hopeful that ARPA-H is going to help, you know, whether it's through policy, through technology, innovation, access to rural settings that we never had before. The power of bringing new standard of care to the American people, I feel like we're right at the precipice of that. And that's really exciting to me.
That is really exciting. Look, I think there's one other point to make, to add to all you, that a friend here made a comment around this intersection between what we think about with relation to defense and then what's also in the national interest. And there's a little bit of an overlap that's happening here, right? We have folks on the panel here from HHS, we have people from DOD, we have people who traditionally would not spend that much time talking to each other, right? And we're having those conversations because we're realizing that what's in the national security interest is also in the national interest, and it cuts across in a multitude of different ways, right? So look, I think we're at time. I'm getting signals from everyone and something beeping at me there. So thank you for a very exciting and informative discussion. Thank you, audience, for making the trek over here and for your questions. I hope you take away one last question with you, which I think is the quote of the day. How do you want to die as your philosophical question? And so we can talk about that at happy hour today. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Vishal, thank you so much, and it's extra thanks to all of our panelists. I think you heard incredible passion and conviction on issues about care and equity and diversity, but also a lot of really intriguing questions from the very frontiers of science. And so one thing I thought you heard is how interesting it was to me how much you all talked about your collaboration, not only with industry and sort of the dynamics around the friction of that, but how much you work with each other and the collaborations that you work together at DARPA and then you work together at DIU. And I think that's just really inspiring to see this community of people in our government industry working together. The note I want to leave you on, though, is I want to make sure you remember a lot of people here invited you to apply for jobs in these incredible organizations. So don't leave. We have an incredible break for you, a great networking opportunity. Go find these people, and this could be your opportunity to have impact, and you could be on stage at South by next year talking about your breakthrough. I think that would be great. So come back here right at 2:30 for how Uncle Sam helps emerging clean energy. So we're going to have a session just like this, all about clean tech. So come back right here at 2:30. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.